I am feeling nervous about whether you can see me because I'm not getting any confirmation about that. Somebody want to tell me if I can be seen and heard? Thank you. That's beautiful. So I'm Kelly Johnson. I'm the Father Fourie Chair of Social Justice. And with my colleague, Shelley Engels, who is the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center at UD, I want to welcome you to the first in a series of teach-ins at the University of Dayton about the COVID-19 pandemic and the common good. So here's how this is going to work. Once a week during the month of April, we'll be hosting short talks by a number of UD faculty from a variety of fields. It's necessary right now that we be apart from each other. That's what we can do to contribute to slowing the spread of this virus. But one of the many things that we've lost in that separation from each other for so much of the semester is the kind of constant conversation that ordinarily goes on between colleagues, faculty, staff, students about what we're experiencing and how we're making sense of it. That's what we do. We're a community gathered around a commitment to seek out truth and to build new knowledge, to grow together toward being whole persons. We do that for the good of the world. We do that mostly by talking and listening to each other. So the fact that we're separated makes that hard. These teach-ins are a small way for us to try to continue that mission, even though we have to be apart. So we'll gather once a week online for the next 4 weeks, and we'll take in turn 4 different ways of thinking about what's happening in this crisis that we're living through. Today, we'll be talking about the common good with a focus on public health and political life. On April 8th, which is next Wednesday, we'll focus on social justice, looking at what's happening with particularly vulnerable groups who are being affected by this crisis. On Friday, April 17th, we'll focus on the economy and workers' rights. And on Friday, April 24th, we'll look at some examples of solidarity in action. So I want to say a quick word of thanks to the Human Rights Center and to the IT specialists from the School of Law for their help in setting this up, and to my colleagues who are giving presentations. You know, we're all living in some strange circumstances and dealing with different stresses, but people are pitching in because this is what we do. We talk to each other. We need to find ways to do it. So I'm grateful also that all of you who are here listening are with us for today. So what's going to happen over the next 3 hours is we have 6 guest speakers who are going to talk about this crisis as a matter of the common good. Each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes, and then we'll stop and do some question and answers. If at that point you have a question you'd like to ask, you can use your little comment thing to raise your hand, and we will let you in then to speak and to raise your question. So we can have some give and take for about 10 minutes. Then we'll have a 5-minute break so that we can set up to start the next speaker. Okay, the full schedule for today and for our next event on April 8th are available on Porches under the campus report and in the Human Rights Center's calendar and events section. So I encourage you to look at those and tune in for things that you're particularly excited about being part of. So we want to start today with thinking about what the common good is. That's my job for the next 10 minutes or so. So let me get my PowerPoint up here for you for a second. So here's a thought experiment that I like to do. What goods can you only have by having them with other people? What's something you can only have by sharing it? Now that's a strange thing to think about. Ordinarily, when we share something, we have less of it. I like pie. If I share my pie, I have less of it. If I share my time, I have less of it. If I share my hand sanitizer, you know where I'm going. So what are the things, though, that you can, in fact, only have by sharing them with other people? Well, there are some such things. The most obvious sorts of examples would be things like this: family, friendship, a marriage, right? These are things you can only have by having them in common with other people. We could also talk about something like living in a great city, being outdoors in a park, seeing other people and having them see you, people watching. If you like being out in festivals in the summer, I can only have that because other people are also enjoying having it. There could be something like, oh, that picture's going to make me cry. We have to move on from that. There could be something like an epic basketball season as a common good. We can only have that because we're all having it together. And for a university, it's important to notice that another one of these is a really great class where the professor is into it and the students are into it, and there's something happening in the way we're pursuing questions that's much more than you could get by reading the material alone, or even in a private tutorial, right? So these are common goods. And what I mean by that is that they're goods we can only have by sharing them with other people. So here's the thing that's happening right now. We're being forced to notice health is a common good. Well, for many of us, most days, me included, it feels like each person's body is an independent system. So I can have my health without having to share in other people's health. But that experience, that appearance is somewhat misleading. And the pandemic has really sharpened our sense of that. This is a line from an open letter that was posted by some concerned physicians back in the middle of March. And you can see what they're saying there is that we are in a moment where all of us are at risk. All of us are connected. This is not just about people who have some underlying health issue or whose immune systems are compromised. We are, in fact, all at risk. And I want to suggest to you that that's not just true of human beings in the case of communicable disease. It's actually fundamentally true of what it is to be a human being. All of us start off as children, as infants. For quite a long childhood, we need people to help us, to care for us. Those people teach us language and a sense of humor and a culture, ways to interact. And we need people as we age, when we get sick, when we get injured. Later in life, we may need help. That's just the truth of who we are. That's what human life is like. Beyond that, we live in systems where we rely on other people's work. This is often invisible to us because we have very long supply chains. We may only notice our interconnection to the people who supply our food, the people who protect our water supply. We may only notice that when something goes wrong, when the supply is interrupted, so it draws our attention to it. But in fact, it is the reality about the way we live all the time. Megan O'Rourke, in talking about specifically about the pandemic and US culture, said the body is a social encounter. This is the thing we have to learn to understand. The body is not a self-enclosed unit, isolated, independent. It is, in fact, something which is always in relationship to others. So that's difficult for a lot of us to wrap our minds around. It's not the way our culture tends to think. It's not the way we operate. I don't know, I couldn't find a great image for this, but you can play along with me. I'm looking for ways to help you think about this idea in US culture that we are independent. We are like the pioneers. We make our own way. We praise people for their self-sufficiency. In fact, I know a lot of people who feel threatened, maybe even insulted, when their need for other people comes to light. I mean, think how often you hear people say something like, I don't want to be a burden, or I'm not looking for your pity. It's as though admitting that we need help makes us feel like we're admitting we're not real human beings. We're not somehow whole. We don't count. I worry that in our culture, this emphasis we have on admiring people who are strong and self-sufficient ends up making us ashamed of this truth about ourselves, that we are interconnected, that we need each other. And it may make us denigrate the full humanity of people who can't conceal their need for other people, who do always rely on other people. But what I want you to think about is that this change, this dying to the illusion of our independence, it's actually a good thing, because there is truth and joy in our interdependence. And I think those of you, if you've been watching the videos coming out, people singing on their balconies in Italy, but musicians finding ways to perform together even when they're isolated from each other. People putting bears up in their windows so the kids can do the hunt for bears around the neighborhood, chalking on sidewalks, whatever your way of doing it is, we are reaching out to each other in this moment. See, what's happening, I think, is that we are recognizing that we're bound by not just these common goods like health and the economy and shared public life and basketball. We're bound by something that is called in Catholic tradition, the common good. That's where this phrase comes from for the University of Dayton. In Catholic thought, the common good, it's got like a big capital "the" in front of it, refers to the kind of political and cultural and social, economic, material, spiritual life of humanity, all of it being like that great class where everybody working together makes something possible that couldn't have happened if we weren't cooperating with each other. The participation of everybody in it is what makes it good. It's a life that we can only have by having it together. So this is why the common good is different from another phrase that you may hear people use, the greater good. That implies that some individuals' well-being should be sacrificed for the sake of a larger number of other individuals. This is a quote from the Compendium of the Social Doctrine of the Catholic Church. That's a source that's available online. You can just Google it and have the whole of it there for free. It has a big section on the common good. And this is one of the things it says about that it has to be common. It's indivisible. We can only have it when we have it together. So it's not something that you can have at the expense of other people or by excluding some people from it. Okay, let's stop that. You can come back to me. Hi, I'm back. So what I want to say about this for you, particularly to notice, is this is not some pie in the sky, dreamy idealism. When we talk about the common good, this is actually the truth about how we are. We are interdependent in health, in meeting our economic needs, in the formation of our culture, in climate change. We're tied to each other. But it is also true that promoting the common good is hard work because we do have conflicting interests. We have serious disagreements. It's not magic, the common good. It's something that we have to work at. It means we can't manage those problems, those conflicts we have, by excluding somebody else from the conversation, by writing their needs out of the equation. So the work of politics is spiritual and moral work and logistical work. It's trying to organize ourselves so that we can live well together. So a commitment to the common good is costly. And it feels that way, I think, especially for those of us who are accustomed to not noticing that we're interdependent, not being accountable to other people. For those of us who are Catholic, we're about to enter into Holy Week. And in the traditions of the founders of UD, this is a time when we reflect on dying to self. That's a way to think about the commitment to common good. It's a kind of a dying to yourself. That's not self-destruction. I'm certainly not advocating that. In Christian thought, this costly gift of self is about purchasing the pearl of great price. You're dying to yourself because that is the path to full life. We might say rather that it is a sharing in Christ's dying and rising, so that in perhaps a really difficult and terrible way right now, we are already beginning to share in a full life, the full life that God intends for us. So, wrapping it up, what all of this means is that in this moment of pandemic, we can notice that the common good names something that is true about humanity. And then we can embrace it instead of running from it. It's something good for us. There's joy. We want to reach out and be in contact with each other. This is something we're looking for. John Paul II called our decision to embrace that mutual connection solidarity, said it's a firm and persevering determination to commit yourself to the common good. So in the fullest sense, the common good is a claim of faith. We don't really know what it looks like. If everybody in the world were able to participate fully, we may find it hard even to imagine what it would look like for everybody on the planet to be flourishing and cooperating with each other, participating in our world. But Christians operate on the hope that this is a reality because it is what God is doing in the world. And that hope, well, it's consistent with reason because we are interdependent and we do flourish when we pay attention to that interdependence. It just goes beyond reason to cause us to look for something that we can't yet know or quite fully understand. That looking for something more, reaching beyond what we already know, that opens up new questions for scholarship, questions in politics and finance and criminal justice and technology and education, and agriculture, and all of them, even theology, to try to think, so what is this common good and what do we need to do in order to make it happen? So right now we're feeling very keenly aware in our physical bodies and our social bodies of how interdependent we are. This is a chance for scholars, for students, to focus on building up the common good of humanity. We have lost something precious in having to distance ourselves from each other. But if we can embrace that cost as part of our solidarity with every person in this moment of shared danger, then I think we can discover in it a new sense of what our humanity is. Okay, I'm gonna stop now my talking and invite you, if you have a question, to hit your little raise your hand button, and we'll see if we can bring you into the conversation for a few minutes. Don't all jump at once. Or you can type in a comment if you would prefer to do it through the comment box. It's very quiet out there.
Hi, Kelly.
Hey, how are you?
I'm well. How are you?
Good. This is Molly Sayer, folks, if you don't know Molly. Molly, you want to say a word about who you are?
Yeah, my name is Molly Mullaney Sayer. I'm a professor in social work in the Department of Sociology, Anthropology, and Social Work at UD. And my question comes from the email that was sent this morning about that included the word layoffs. And so I'm interested in a discussion about what the common good and the University for the Common Good looks like and acts like in an economics era where layoffs are part of the discussion and part of the experience. And I'm assuming we would agree that, you know, applying the idea, Kelly, you had said that isolating ourselves is part of solidarity. And I don't think we would extend that to layoffs necessarily, that layoffs would be part of solidarity. But how do we make sense of this in the context of the common good, or do we? Is it something separate?
Hey, thanks. I certainly would not say it's something separate. I think this is exactly the kind of thing when I said promoting the common good is work, and it's not magic, and it can be painful and difficult. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. This is a real issue. The university is in a period of great financial uncertainty. I think I'm not privy to all of those conversations, right? So I'm not inclined to second guess people's judgments. I would say, though, that I think it's incumbent on people at UD, the leadership and all of us at UD, to be clear that we are in fact committed to making sure that for our community, nobody goes without the things that they have to have in this period. And if that means having conversations about something like One Day, One Dayton, in which people in the university who have high salaries that are more than they need can chip in to provide a fund to meet needs for people who may be in more distress, maybe that's part of it. I think I would also want to put it in a larger context. This isn't just on UD, because this also has to do with how the country, the United States, thinks about unemployment and about a basic salary for every person and access to healthcare for every person, regardless of their position. So I think there is a question for UD about how we're going to manage this, and I hope that that can be a broad-based conversation where a lot of people can pitch in, not to make unreasonable demands, but to think realistically, right, how we can address this, but also that all of us would be active in expressing to the state and to national leaders what our expectations are for care of people who are at this point in great need. I actually think, this is a moment for us to reflect. This is not a new problem, right? This is a Molly knows this better than I do, long-running problem in the United States, that there are people who go without health care, without adequate nutrition, without housing. And if we don't want to live in a society like that, then we have to press for change in the politics and the culture, in the way that we organize our economic life. So I think it's a great question, and I will be very happy to see a continuing conversation about it.
Just to add, Kelly, that the third part of this series focuses quite explicitly on the economic system, workers' rights, and issues around the economy that are happening in relation to the pandemic. So that conversation can also take place throughout this series, and we will have a number of colleagues speaking from their perspective on particularly those issues. Of course, that doesn't answer your ultimate question about decisions being made around the university, but it is another way to enter into that conversation and to be thinking about it more deeply. And as Kelly said, of course, this is a very broad economic question for not only UD, but for many universities, many businesses around the country and globally.
Yeah, thank you, Shelley. I don't know so I'm gonna say we need to pause at this point to honor our schedule, and we'll take a 5-minute break while we're changing over to our next speaker, who will be Dr. Sabrina Neely. So everybody hang out, go get yourself a glass of water or stretch your legs, whatever, and we'll restart at 3:30 with Dr. Neely talking about the public health dimensions and the virus itself. Okay, thank you, everybody. Hi, everybody. So we're back for the second session in our teach-in today, and we're joined now by Sabrina Neely, who is the Associate Dean for Health Sciences in the School of Education and Health Sciences and Associate Professor in the Department of Health and Sports Science. Dr. Neely is on the Board of Directors of the Association for Prevention, Teaching, and Research and chairs the APTR Policy Committee. I don't know what that is, but it sounds really important. So we're really grateful that you'll join us today. I'll let you take it off.
Thank you very much. Pardon my housekeeping for just a couple of seconds while I share my screen. Okay, as she said, my name is Sabrina Neely. I'm the Associate Dean for Health Sciences in the School of Education and Health Sciences. My background is as a health behaviorist and also as a public health professional. So today I want to start off by talking about pandemics, public health, and the common good. Now, one thing I want to do really quick, I know that some of you may have been soaking up all this information that you can about the pandemic coronavirus, but for those of you who haven't, I want to start with a short video from Johns Hopkins. It has some basic information about the virus. Now, one thing I have to caution, if you've been out looking online for information about the pandemic and what's going on, as you know, things are changing so rapidly that by the time that we have these materials available to us, they're often dated. So you'll see even in this video that's not that old, you'll actually hear some references to information that has changed even since that time. One thing that I want to start off with is just an important reminder about this particular coronavirus. This particular coronavirus, and it's mentioned in the video, was zoonotic, which means that it's a virus that typically existed in animals, but was recently transmitted to humans. That means that none of us had any antibodies to it, which is why it's so dangerous. So I'm going to go ahead and get the video started and so that you can see this.
Okay, we're going to have a technical break here and see if we can work out why the video is not showing up for us.
Okay, sorry. Let me go ahead and stop it and I'll just go back to my part then. Sorry about that. I didn't realize that the video wasn't playing. Can everyone see can you see the slides now? Okay. Well, sorry about that. I apologize that the video didn't work. Most of you are, like I said, somewhat familiar with what's going on with the coronavirus. You've heard a lot on TV, you've seen press conferences, you've read more about this particular virus and why it's so concerning. So now that we know a little bit more about the coronavirus, what I want to do is I want to speak for just a bit about why a public health approach is required and how a public health approach reinforces our notion of solidarity during times like this. The goal of public health is to protect the health and well-being of communities, entire populations, and even global populations. The focus is on the needs of the collective over the needs of the individual. This is a very different framework than that of healthcare, which focuses on the individual patient. However, we have to remember that the health and well-being of an individual is reflective of the health and well-being of their community, and vice versa. The health and well-being of the community is reflective of the health and well-being of its individuals. Public health provides 10 essential services to a community. This is done through a network of local public health agencies, such as our Public Health Dayton and Montgomery County, who are linked to state agencies, such as the Ohio Department of Health, who are linked to national agencies, such as the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and even international agencies, such as the World Health Organization. All of these services come to play in a pandemic situation. Public health is constantly monitoring a population for ongoing cases of a disease, and then watching for anomalies that would suggest that we might have an outbreak of some type of disease. Public health also investigates the source of disease spread through contact tracing, informs, educates, and empowers through briefings with government officials and the public. Public health mobilizes community partnerships, often with healthcare and government agencies, develops policies such as closures and stay-at-home orders, enforces laws such as mandatory quarantines, links to and provides care through referrals to testing and treatment, assures a competent workforce by continual training for situations such as these pandemics, evaluates response and adjusts guidelines for the next situation, and also engages in research. So just to give you a really quick crash course in epidemiology so that you understand some of the concepts that you're hearing about on the news in particular. Incidence refers to the number of new cases of a disease. This is typically measured on a daily basis during a pandemic and is referred to as daily case count on the ODH COVID-19 dashboard. Prevalence is the total number of cases of disease currently experienced in a population. This is what Governor DeWine reports in his daily briefings and is referred to as the total cases or existing case count on the ODH COVID-19 dashboard. The case fatality rate is the number of people who die from a particular disease divided by the total number of cases. The reproduction number is the average number of people who will catch a disease from an infected person. This is a measure actually of contagion or disease severity and typically ranges below 1 to above 1. So let me kind of explain briefly what that means, because you may see reference during this coronavirus pandemic to the reproduction rate. If the reproductive rate is less than 1, this means that each existing infection will cause less than 1 new infection. In this case, the disease will decline and ultimately die out. In the case of a pandemic, such as the one that we're going through right now, this typically does not happen until we either have a vaccine or the majority of the population has been infected and has antibodies. If your R0 equals 1, each existing infection causes 1 new infection. The disease will stay alive and stable, but there won't be an outbreak or an epidemic. In this case, we typically talk about the disease as being endemic in the population. If, however, your reproduction rate is more than 1, this means that each existing infection causes more than one new infection. The disease will spread between people and will spread quickly. This is when we get an outbreak or an epidemic. And this is the current situation that we're in right now with COVID-19. There has been some studies trying to estimate what the reproduction number is right now. I haven't seen any lately on the US that are very accurate because it's moving so quickly. When the case was mostly isolated in China, the estimation was that the reproduction number was somewhere around 2 or 3. And then finally, the epidemic curve is the visual representation of the disease outbreak. And this is what we'll refer to, and we'll talk about again here in just a minute when we talk about flattening the curve. I believe this quote really speaks to the heart of why a public health approach is necessary when we face a pandemic. In our society, we are so interdependent that my health depends on you and your health depends on me. A good example of our interdependence is the social distancing situation that we're currently in. While social distancing for public health purposes seems on the surface to be the antithesis of interdependence, it is this very interdependence that requires us to physically distance ourselves from each other, something that we are not used to doing in order to protect everyone from the spread of the virus. I may engage in social distancing to protect myself and others, but I also have to trust that those I encounter are social distancing as well. While Ohio's stay-at-home order was issued a couple of weeks ago, we're now starting to see how our solidarity and social distancing is flattening that epidemic curve. The yellow peak represents the anticipated cases of COVID-19 had there been no intervention. This is that surge that hospitals fear because they do not have enough resources to treat that many patients in such a short period of time. Effective social distancing by the greatest number of people in a population, which is what we've been asked to do, reduces the number of people who might be infected, as shown in the previous slide, and then it stretches that spread out over a longer period of time, allowing more time for the hospitals to prepare and have resources in place. This is the blue curve on the graph. This public health strategy is the best tool we have in a pandemic when there are not enough tests, no assured safe and effective treatment, and no vaccine. Now, there have been times in history, which Dr. Lawrence Sanders will discuss in more detail at 5 o'clock, in which some citizens were valued more highly than others, allowing disease to spread untreated and allowing health disparities to increase. More recently, public health has turned its attention to addressing these disparities and finding ways to achieve better health equity. I want to end my presentation with 2 final thoughts. The first is a quote from Matthew Loftus from his article, Public Health and the Common Good, which appeared in the publication Comment on October 16, 2014. Embracing the idea that the health of other humans created in the Imago Dei requires an active cultivation of the environment in which we live is a crucial first step to pursuing the common good inherent in public health. The second is a post I saw on social media just a couple of days ago, created by Paul Williams, and I really think it sums up what we're trying to focus on today. When you go out and you see the empty streets, the empty stadiums, the empty train platforms, don't say to yourself, it looks like the end of the world. What you're seeing is love in action. What you are seeing in that negative space is how much we do care for each other, for our grandparents, for our immunocompromised brothers and sisters, for people we will never meet. People will lose jobs over this. Some will lose their businesses, and some will lose their lives. All the more reason to take a moment when you're out on your walk or on your way to the store or just watching the news to look into that emptiness and marvel at all of that love. Let it fill you and sustain you. It isn't the end of the world. It is the most remarkable act of global solidarity we may ever witness. I have one final slide with some resources. Most of these you're familiar with. I want to say thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk a little bit about this today, and I'm happy to take any questions if anyone has any.
Sabrina,
Yes,
I can ask you a quick question
sure.
to get us started. So how do you think Ohio's doing?
Actually, Ohio's doing pretty well. If you look at, there's a lot of resources out there. There's, if you're a person that loves visual representation, there's some really amazing maps that are available where different people around the country are mapping what some of the social distancing looks like. The fact that you can look at that epidemic curve and see that it's flattening, that is a sign that what we're doing is working. We're not seeing that surge yet. Our healthcare workers, I have a lot of friends who work in healthcare, and what they're basically saying right now is we're seeing cases. We feel like it's the calm before the storm. We're a little afraid of what's coming down the road, but they still feel somewhat confident right now that we have not hit that surge. Now, the estimation, the latest estimations that are coming from Ohio Department of Health is they are expecting us to have a surge or to have our greatest number of cases somewhere probably mid-April, maybe as late as early May. So that's one of the reasons why Governor DeWine extended the stay-at-home order to the end of April. We have not seen quite that surge yet. Our numbers are going up, but they're not doubling on a daily basis, which is what concerns everybody, and that's usually an indication that your surge is coming. So from the standpoint of how we're doing compared to a lot of other states, we're doing pretty well.
Okay. We've got a bunch of questions coming in now, so I'm
okay.
going to take them in the order they came in. So, Jennifer, do you want to get in and ask your question? I think I've unmuted you. No, I did not unmute you. Let me try that again. There you are.
Hi, Jennifer.
Can you see me? Okay. Hi, Dr. Neely. I was wondering if you could comment a little on the potential effect, particularly for colleges, when states don't all have consistent stay-at-home orders.
Yes. Thank you for that question. That's actually a really great question. One of the things that we're seeing is because there has been an inconsistency in stay-at-home orders because they have been issued by governors, kind of one at a time or as a triple in a sort of trickle-down effect, as opposed to a big national order. We are seeing issues, particularly that came up. All of this happened at really a bad time from the standpoint of everybody being on spring break. And so what we're seeing now is we're seeing the after effects of that. There's a story that was just out about, there was a group of 70 University of Texas students that all went on spring break together about a week and a half or 2 weeks ago. And now I think it's something close to 40 of them have now tested positive. So, you know, what we're seeing is it perfectly plays out when it's not consistent, when it happens kind of a little at a time, or as people get panicked, then what you may end up is you may end up with what they call these hot spots. So we're seeing these hot spots in Florida because we knew that a lot of college students were in Florida during spring break. A lot of families were vacationing in Florida during spring break. We're also now seeing a hot spot in New Orleans, which they're attributing to everyone that came to New Orleans just a few weeks ago for Mardi Gras.
Okay. I have, let's see, I had Nate. Where are you, Nate? Hey, there he is. Oh,
He's still muted.
trying to unmute him. Unmute. Unmute. Sorry, Nate. I am clicking your button and it's not unmuting you.
Here I am.
Hey, there you are.
Hey, here we go. Have they been able to recognize the presence of any antigens in people who may have had the COVID-19 and recovered from it?
Supposedly there was some testing of antigens going on primarily in China, where we saw this earlier. I was just reading an article earlier today because there's a lot of speculation that once we can test for that, we can figure out who's been exposed, who has antibodies. The issue that we have right now is that as of in the US, we don't have a great test right now, and it's not widespread enough for us to really deploy it in a way that would be effective for us to determine who's already been infected, who already has antibodies. Once we have that, certainly it will help us to identify where we need to send more resources, or even there's speculation and there's some studies going on of people who may have the antibodies who perhaps survived this, and being able to use blood transfusions from those individuals to help treat those who are in critical condition with the virus. It's just not available yet.
Okay, thank you.
Let's see. Masha, did I get you?
Hi, Masha.
Hi. Okay, so I think a lot of us are trying to imagine the future. Sorry, I'm in my bed. I've escaped my children upstairs. I think a lot of us are trying to imagine a lot of things right now, how they're going to play out. So I'm going to ask you to imagine something as well. So I know that testing and tracing has been really useful in other countries. And so I'm constantly checking the rate of testing in the US. There's that great chart on Politico.
Mm-hmm.
I'm just trying to imagine, even if we had lots of testing and tracing, but still no vaccine and no good treatment, would that be a scenario where we could reopen schools and universities? How do you see that playing out? What kind of a testing situation could there be where that is really our only tool, but it's used broadly? Does that question make sense?
Oh yeah, it does. That's a great question. Actually, we have a couple of examples from other countries where basically when they started seeing their cases, what they did was they immediately went in and started doing what's called contact tracing, which once you have a confirmed case, then you start to look at and you start to identify who are all the individuals that the infected individual came into contact with over the past couple of weeks. And then what they were doing is they were going in generally and quarantining both the infected person and everyone that they came into contact with, and hoping to slow the spread that way. Once we have widespread testing, there is hope that we can determine how many people in the population really do have this disease and are asymptomatic. That's a big concern because we know that asymptomatic individuals can then spread this. Know how many people actually have this, then we can start to put in some of these mitigation measures until we have a vaccine, until we have really effective treatment. So it probably would be a stricter quarantine, but it would be at a smaller scale than an entire community or an entire state. I know that at the federal level, this is what they're talking about in terms of being able to go in, test and see if an area has fewer cases, and if it has fewer cases, perhaps opening that area back up to more economic activity. But it's difficult until we have widespread testing. So right now, what they're telling everyone is, if you even have symptoms or suspect that you may have come into contact with someone who is positive, they are asking that you actually self-quarantine everyone that may have come into contact for those 2 weeks, just to be sure.
Thanks. Okay, I think we have Linda, where is it? Linda Pullman. You with us, Linda?
Yes, thank you.
Hi, Linda.
Hi, how are you, Sabrina?
Good, how are you?
Good. My question kind of goes to what Masha was asking. In a way, I'm concerned that, so we're trying to flatten the curve and doing this by social distancing. My concern is about in the stay-at-home order, when all of that is lifted and we do go back and about doing our routine, but there isn't a vaccine in place, how how will that curve remain flattened, and how will we? I just have that fear that it will increase again.
Right.
And it sounds like it's the testing to find out, that seems to be the best way, but I'm just kind of wondering how that's where my concern is. And
Right.
that's what I don't understand about it.
Sure. There actually is speculation and some concern that we may see our numbers drop off. We may see the curve flattening over the course of the summer, and then as we move into the fall and the winter, that we may see it rise again if we don't have particularly widespread testing to determine who is contagious. And if we don't have, we don't expect to have a vaccine by the fall. It just takes a lot longer than that. There is speculation, and in fact, Dr. Fauci had made some comments not too long ago that he anticipated that we will see an upswing again in the fall and into the winter.
We will. Okay, thank you.
Hey, Jennifer, did you want to, oops, if I got you. Can I bring you back in for your other question?
My question was answered. I'm good.
Okay,
Thank
great.
you. Thank you.
So we have, Dr. Neely, we have a question. Could you go back, two things about what was up in your slides?
Okay.
One was the second to last slide that Zaria is saying she missed. And the other was, can you tell us where that last slide, where that quote came from? Because people would like to look at that and use it themselves and spread it around some more. Is that available online?
Sure, absolutely. Let me see if I can pull this back up really quickly so that those of you who missed it earlier, so you can see it. And honestly, I found it on social media. I do not know who this, I do not know who this individual is. I had actually seen someone else post it and thought it was just pretty phenomenal quote because it really spoke to what we were talking about today and what we've been talking about. I don't know, this gentleman apparently has an Instagram account. So probably if you followed him or went to his Instagram account, I'm guessing that's probably the best place to find it.
Okay, thanks. And can you go back to the third slide from the end?
This one?
Let's see, Zaria, is that what you're looking for?
The comment or the quote from comment?
Let me see if I can get back in my, Zaria, let me bring you in so you can speak for yourself there. There you go. You should be able to talk now.
Looking for this one right here.
This is the one.
This is the one.
Okay, great. We got you. Okay, good. Great. Thank you. We should
Yes.
call a halt there and take a break, a quick break, and we'll be back with our next talk in just a couple more minutes. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sabrina. And whoops.
Turn my video on.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me to participate in this teach-in today about the response to COVID-19. I'm an associate professor in the political science department. So I am going to talk a little bit about the government response to COVID-19. I'll talk a little bit about international versus US federal and then US state and local. I have a handful of slides I'm going to share, so kind of bear with me as I share my screen and get that all up and running. So go from the beginning. All right. So probably the first question that a lot of people are asking, and I think there was some Sabrina talked about this a little bit, is why hasn't there been a national lockdown order? Many other countries have a national stay-at-home order in effect. Why hasn't this happened in the US? I just spoke with a research colleague of mine who lives in the country of Colombia, and they are literally on a national lockdown. They need to have a really good reason for why they're out of their home. And if they are outside of their home and it's not a good reason, there are some pretty significant monetary fines. A lot of why we don't have a national lockdown order is because, interestingly enough, the president has a lot of authority, but that's one piece of authority that it's really questionable whether or not the US government can order all of us to stay in our homes. And a lot of this is coming through from the 10th Amendment of the US Constitution that leaves basically anything that's not explicitly stated in the US Constitution becomes the purview of the states. So in this instance, the police power, the ability of the government to tell you, like, you can't go out or you can only do these things, actually rests with the state governments and state governors. The federal government has a lot of resources to bring to bear in terms of monetary resources, coordination resources, stockpiles of medical equipment. But when it comes to being able to level orders to either close schools or close down essential businesses, it's the state governments that this task falls through, usually through the emergency powers of the state governor. So what are our federal, state, and local governments doing? So some of the things I'm sure many of you have heard that the federal government has done to date is we have declared a formal national emergency for the spread of the coronavirus. President Trump has said he is willing to use the Defense Production Act. The Defense Production Act can be used by the federal government to mandate or force private corporations to produce materials that are needed for the emergency. This was passed and signed into law by President Truman. It's been used during the Korean War and sometimes during the Vietnam conflict as well, to force private corporations to produce defense materials. In this case, we're talking about GM, Ford, 3M producing ventilators and other personal protective equipment. The CDC, the Center for Disease Control, will make recommendations, right? The CDC has recommended that you don't have groups more than 10 gather. The CDC is recommending that people stay at home and social distance. Potentially, it sounds like the CDC may recommend that we all wear some kind of mouth or mask covering when we go out in public now. But in none of these instances has the CDC required or ordered that we do these things. Many governors are choosing to take those CDC recommendations and turn them into orders for their citizens. There's the national stockpile of medical supplies, which the federal government, using both FEMA and the military, to distribute to the states in terms of what they need. A lot of the feedback coming back from states is that the distribution right now seems a little bit uneven, given that this is a national pandemic. the stockpile was never intended for a national pandemic. It was set up more to deal with really localized or regional emergencies like terrorist attacks or natural disasters. It wasn't meant for something, it really wasn't designed or meant for all 50 states to be asking for access to it at the same time. Now that every state, with the exception of West Virginia, has declared its own state of emergency, which is actually a really important thing to do, because the federal government can't come in with emergency aid like from FEMA until the state governor has declared a state of emergency in their state and requested that support. Again, this is another quirk of federalism and that kind of level of sovereignty between the federal and the state government. The federal government can't come in and impose itself on the state. The state has to ask for that help from FEMA. But declaring your emergency and then getting the federal government to also recognize that disaster in your state then provides another resource for states through the FEMA response. There's also the relief legislation that's been passed by Congress that's going to include direct payments to Americans to help cover some of the expenses, support for small businesses, bailouts for some major industries, and I suspect there will probably be several more pieces of relief legislation that are federal. Coordination. The federal government actually can provide a lot of coordination between the states in these cases. Like, for example, I talked earlier about the federal government having resources. And so the federal government has these resources and is probably better suited to go out on the market and buy PPE and ventilators, as opposed to creating a system, which we've kind of seen in the past few weeks, of the 50 states and the federal government kind of ending up in some small bidding wars over trying to purchase those items. So what have state governments been doing? So at the same time the federal government is engaging in all of these activities, the state governments are doing some of the same activities and additional things. So executive orders. So we've got a patchwork of 50 different sets of executive orders that are mandating whether or not people should stay home and socially distance from one another, whether or not essential businesses are closed, closing of K through 12 schools, closing of state and private universities to in-person instruction, shutting down of restaurants and bars. States themselves, to a lesser scale right now, are doing their own relief legislation. For example, last week, the state of Ohio, the Ohio legislature and Governor DeWine passed passed some legislation that would expand who's eligible for unemployment benefits, trying to get that to people quicker. As well as dealing with some of the questions about, well, what happens if K through 12 schools are closed for the duration of the year. Healthcare preparedness. I think if you tune in to the 2 p.m. press conferences that the governor is having virtually daily, a lot of the talk is about we are trying to flatten the curve so our healthcare systems are prepared. So one of the things that's gone on over the past week was the separation of the state into I believe it was 8 different zones or 8 different regions. All of the hospitals and public health departments were asked to make plans on how they were going to work together to be prepared for the surge. And now those 8 zones have been then broken down into 3 different regions. So the government, the state government, is playing an important role into helping what normally would be kind of competing healthcare centers work together to make sure that we can manage the surge that is coming. Local governments are also involved in terms of making local orders. In Ohio's case right now, the state government has given the authority to local law enforcement and local public health departments to enforce the stay-at-home order, as well as the non-essential business order. So the state is not kind of doing the direct oversight to make sure that we're all paying attention. They've left that up to local governments. Local governments are also providing a lot of support services. And in some states, it's the local governments that are kind of doing the orders to tell people to stay at home or closing down restaurants and bars. There are still 11 states that don't have a a statewide stay-at-home order. I had been putting a map in here of that all week, and every day it changes. So I got frustrated and decided rather than give you incomplete information, I would just talk about it. So some of those states are largely states in the plains. So like South Dakota, North Dakota, Montana, places where they don't have a lot of cases yet. And so a lot of that has been happening on a more local basis where those states are identifying some hot spots that may be popping up. The big places that don't have those orders in place right now, South Carolina does not have a statewide stay-at-home order yet. Texas does not, although the city of Houston does. So some of the bigger cities in Texas, the local government has put those in. One more. So some of the actions, and I've talked about some of these before, that the state and local governments have taken: social distancing orders. Somewhere in the range of about 10 states have worked to expand unemployment benefits. They're doing things like passing orders to prohibit the shutting off of utilities for people. So they're also trying to think largely about kind of related public health questions. So not just about being prepared for the coronavirus surge, but if you're telling people that you can't leave your home and then you're closing non-essential businesses and people are getting laid off, they're going to have trouble paying bills. So we're also passing orders to make sure that they still have kind of basic utilities in those homes. Waiving of standardized tests and report cards for K through 12, ensuring and making people understand that current seniors in high school can still graduate, waiving certification tests for recently graduated nursing students, trying to get as many public health workers available as they can. A lot of school districts are still delivering breakfast and lunch meals to students, recognizing that for a lot of students, that breakfast or lunch that they get at school, it might be their primary meal of the day. Working with the private sector to avoid evictions. In some cases, states are rescheduling primaries. The really interesting thing about this, and I'll kind of come on the screen to give you guys a break from slides for a minute, is how this works in different states works in different ways, which makes it both challenging and sometimes potentially frustrating. So here in Ohio, we all kind of associate the stay-at-home order with Governor DeWine, but Governor DeWine's is actually not the one who's empowered by the state of Ohio to make us stay home. That's actually Dr. Amy Acton. For the orders that are directed right at public health and the coronavirus crisis, she's the one who decides that that signed the order that K through 12 should be closed, or that we should stay at home until May 1st. She's actually the one who ordered the in-person primary close as a public health crisis. And it's Governor DeWine is the one who's writing the orders that are around the more economic-based things, like, telling public utilities not to shut off water supplies to people's homes, or making helping make unemployment easier to get. But in California, Governor Newsom actually has the power to do that. He's kind of considered the chief public health officer as well. So one of the things that's come across this, and I had a discussion with research colleagues earlier this week, there's a really it's really interesting to see some of how this is mapping out has a lot to do with who has the authority to make these orders, what are their backgrounds. So like in Ohio, the director of public health doesn't have to be a doctor or a public health professional. Up until Dr. Atkin, the past couple have been people from the business community. And so one wonders, would you get the same level of orders from them that you're getting from somebody with an MD and a master's in public health? So to wrap up, what we're seeing here is government solving the collective action problem. And this is sort of a quintessential thing. The reason why it's not as easy to tell us all to stay at home and enforce it is because the US isn't set up for the government to provide that much authority over our lives, right? Liberty is really important to us, but with liberty comes personal responsibility. And unfortunately, what's always what's best for the collective or the common good isn't always what's in our personal interest. All right. For those of us that can't go to work, we're potentially losing jobs, and that's our livelihood. The state government, the state is going to hurt from being shut down because it's not collecting gas taxes, sales taxes, income taxes. But government is really the only entity that can the state government is the only entity that can step in and kind of make us do the thing that's good for the collective good, right? We tried to tell people to not congregate, and everybody went out to restaurants and bars, and we had to stop that by telling us that we couldn't do it by shutting them down. So I am happy to answer any questions. If you're looking for other resources for government stuff, the best thing to do is to tune in to Governor DeWine or your governor's daily press briefings on these things. There's quite the following for Governor DeWine on Twitter now. He has a really good Twitter feed when he does these, if you can't watch it on PBS or your local news channel. Thank you. I'll take any questions anybody has.
Thanks, Nancy. You all can either use your little thing to raise your hand or send a message to Shelley Ingalls to let us know that you have a question you'd like to raise.
Alex, you can go ahead.
I've just been studying Hungary since the summer, and Viktor Orban specifically. How concerned are you about the rise of totalitarianism in certain countries like Hungary, where he's been given full emergency powers without even Parliament or the courts really checking him?
So I'm going to preface this with, American state and local politics is my field of expertise. But I think anytime that if the other branches of government, if you normally, and Eastern Europe is always an interesting case because they spent so much time under an authoritarian system that they always have a tendency to sometimes slide back in that direction. But anytime if you get someone in the executive branch with authoritarian tendencies, and if the other institutions that are meant to check them either acquiesce that power or don't exercise that power, there is always the potential to slide in that direction. And which is some reason why you've seen the situation in the U.S. where the federal government can't come in and just say everybody stay home. There's and even state government only has so much power to do that. Basically, the sanction for most people if they get caught being outside of their stay-at-home order, and Governor DeWine has even said this, the whole point of this isn't to be punitive. Initially you're supposed to try to work with the person. I don't even know that if Ohio has any sanction in place. I know Mayor de Blasio in New York had talked about imposing a fine system for people being outside and out and about the city if they didn't have good reason. So yeah, anytime I think you see the other branches of government, whether it's a legislature or the courts, either vest the executive with power and then don't check it when they need to, there's always the risk of kind of moving toward a more authoritarian system.
Any other questions?
Hold on, there's something from Natalie. Natalie, let me unmute you. There you go.
Oh, great, thanks. Hi, Nancy.
Hey, Natalie.
How's it going?
It's going okay.
Thanks so much. I wonder if you can provide any more insight into sort of bureaucratic politics at local, state, and federal levels with regard to testing, and why testing was so far, we were so far behind the ball, and its inability to be effective and accessible and widespread. If what your sense is in terms of both the politics and just sort of regulation at various levels played into that process, or I guess lack thereof.
It's a combination of both politics and and red tape / bureaucracy, right? We essentially the best place to start with getting the mass amount of testing that would have been needed would have been at the federal level, and have the CDC organize that, since they would be the ones that would probably have to approve any testing. And I mean, it's pretty clear we blew about a 2-month window where we could have been prepping tests. From what I've been able to read, up in Washington, somebody at the University of Washington developed a test, and the FDA and the CDC came in and said, stop using it, we need to test it. For whatever reason, the CDC decided that they were going to develop their own test, even though the WHO came around and said, hey, here's the test we're using in other countries. And I think I think the administration federally decided, the plan was going to be, we've got this. It's not going to be a big problem here. We've got it contained. First, it's like, oh, we've got it contained in Washington. It's not going to spread. And I think what everybody has learned about this is it sneaks up on every place. It looks like it's not a big deal, but because of the exponential growth and how silent it is in spreading, that explodes really fast to the point that you just can't keep up. So hopefully we're now in a process that while we're doing all of the things we're trying to do to deal with the surge that we can't stop now, there's another part of the government that's focused on getting the reagents and the things we need to do mass testing. The other issue too is the fact that this is a global supply chain issue too. So from what I understand is that for the initial testing, the swabs and the primary place in which the swabs are produced was Northern Italy. So we think about, oh, there must be tons of places that make all these things. And the reality is there isn't. From what I understand, there are only 3 companies that were making that had the ability to make the initial reagents needed to test the swabs. One was in Germany, one may have been in Italy and Spain, and the others in the US. And so I think that part of the problem with the testing is there's just massive global demand, and the supply chain for the materials we need to conduct the testing, as well as the reagents for the testing, were all in other countries that were infected and fighting their own battle. And just simply not enough places that produced it. And like anything, it's just going to take time to retrofit other places to produce those things. It's kind of like when you hear talk about GM and Ford making ventilators. And when you hear President Trump talk about it, it sounds like, oh, GM and Ford will be having ventilators out to everybody in 3 days. But they're still a few weeks away from being able to produce one, because you can't just take a plant that makes engines and flip it into making ventilators in 24 hours. It takes several weeks to get to that point. So we're behind the curve, and even just trying to retrofit our manufacturing plants to make the things we need. And some of that's bureaucracy in terms of the things you have to do those things, in terms of, getting the FDA to approve. And they've fast tracked a lot of things. Like normally we wouldn't be already testing a vaccine in humans this soon, and we are doing that. So for some of this now, it's literally just a waiting game of how long it takes to make sure a vaccine's safe, how long it takes to find companies that can transition into making the things we need, and then get the materials you need to make those things, wherever they're located in the world, whether those supply lines are still open to us. Right at this point, every country that is capable of producing these things has an incentive to keep those things to themselves, or make sure they have enough first before they're willing to ship it outside their borders. Does that help, Natalie? Oh, she's muted and I can't see her, so we'll get the hang of virtual things.
I think Daria Graham has a question. Over to you, Daria.
Hi, Daria.
Hi. Can you hear me? No, it wasn't really a question. It was an appreciation for the statement that you made about the fact that common good. I've been asked to start my video. Go Flyers. That the common good doesn't mean that it will necessarily be for the benefit of all. And sometimes that's the challenge, is that in our privileged identities, we really struggle with decisions that are made that don't benefit us. And sure, I feel like it's human nature to push against those, but there are times when, if we really want to reflect common good, that the decisions that are made are not common and they're not for the benefit of everyone. So I appreciate that statement. When you said it, it was a amen moment for me, but I was muted, so you couldn't hear it.
I'm glad it was. I mean, and I think sometimes we talk about so much lately. I think of our politics has been talking about how the need for government to be smaller and to be out of our lives. But I don't, because oftentimes, and I wish it didn't take a global pandemic to recognize there are times when we need government to step in and solve a problem. Because if you left it, and I've heard more libertarian commentators talk about, like, we don't need all these orders, people are just doing it. I'm like, no, people are doing it because the governor literally shut down the bar and the restaurant and we can't go there. If you left those things open, I think lines in Chicago for St. Patrick's Day and lines around Columbus to go to bars on St. Patrick's Day showed that we all can't, while many of us were heating and staying at home and not doing these things, not everybody's going to do it. And so you need government to come in and make us do things sometimes.
And because we don't think about it, right?
Right.
That's not our thought. Our thoughts don't lean there. They lean towards most times towards our own needs. And so we can thoughtlessly do harm. And it's not because we meant to, but because someone wasn't there that was thinking about the area that we were not or can't. So thank you again.
Thanks,
I can
Daria.
be muted.
Okay.
Nancy?
Yeah.
Miranda Malone has a question.
Dr. Miller.
Hey, Miranda.
Thanks for your presentation. I'm wondering, and you kind of hinted to some of this when you were answering or commenting on Dr. Graham's comment, but what do you think some of the long-term implications of this crisis will be politically, and how the American people view government, and how I just wonder if you have any reflections at this point, even though things are changing so rapidly, about how this will impact us politically and socially in the future.
So in terms of how this is going to impact state governments, it's going to tighten budgets, right? As some of us individually are going to take economic and financial hits, every state government is, right? Unlike the federal government, the state local governments can't just make more money, or just use fake money when it's making a budget and go into debt and deficits. Every state has to balance a budget, so there's going to be limited resources for public services for quite some time at the state level. So that's kind of practical politics. Potentially, I think for like larger politics, lately there's been a lot of anti-government sentiment. We're going to get an outsider in to be president. We're going to elect an outsider here, and I think in the states where this is being managed better. So, there are a bunch of people already writing about grading the governors, right? And Mike DeWine is up there, being rated as the governor, one of the governors who's doing a really great job. I mean, right? If Governor DeWine did his job right, there's going to be a whole bunch of Ohioans really mad at him because they're going to feel like we did all of this and it was no big deal. And that's the hard part with this, because success here isn't really, it's not measurable, because the success here is not having a really horrific outcome. And if Governor DeWine did this right, we're all going to feel like he chicken littled us, but he really didn't. It's because he did it right.
We should probably call a halt to this fabulous conversation so that we can make room for the next speaker. Last word?
Stay safe, everybody, and healthy, and stay connected as best you can on Zoom.
Hey, thank you. This was really great. And thanks everybody for the energetic question and answer period. Okay, stretch your legs for a very short time, and we'll be back with Dr. Meredith Montgomery in just a minute or two. Hi, Meredith.
Hi.
About ready to restart here in a minute. Let me check. So we're coming back for the fourth speaker already this afternoon. Dr. Meredith Montgomery is joining us. She's assistant professor and clinical coordinator in the Counseling, Education, and Human Services program in the School of Education and Health Sciences. So take it away, Dr. Montgomery.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you all for having me and for participating in this discussion. I love the tone of the day has been really great, and your questions have been fantastic as well. I have been warned, but I do have a plain background because my natural environment, this chair has a little peacock tail on it, is a quick peek into my kitchen, and that's not really professional. So we're going to use the blue background instead. But I am going to share my screen with you so you can see my slides here. Here we go. So I'm going to ask to talk a little bit about mental health and how mental health relates to public health. So that's what we're going to do when I can get my slides to go forward. There we go. I want to start off just quickly with some definitions. One is I'm going to talk in terms of wellness rather than health. Wellness is, it's been defined by the World Health Organization. This is a definition that is used across health professionals, whether they be physical health, mental health, social health. And that definition is that well-being is really a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease or infirmity. So there's a measure beyond just I'm not sick, but also I am doing well. I have things that are working in my life. And so you'll see that the conversations that we're having today are really a reflection of this holistic look at health. And mental health, when we talk about mental health, a lot of folks will use that term just to describe your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors. Clinically speaking, however, when we talk about mental health, we are looking at the whole person. And so that's what I want to talk about a little bit today. I also better start my little clock and make sure I'm keeping on time. There are 8 widely accepted dimensions of wellness or health. You may, if you went searching for a wellness wheel, you could find versions that have 7 dimensions or 12 dimensions. Different folks have kind of broken this down into different categories, but these 8 are widely accepted. And the way that I've designed these slides is if you want to focus in on just the highlights, look on the right. If you want lots and lots of detailed information, look left, or you can kind of take in that whole picture. But these various categories, every single person has these dimensions of health in their makeup. And I'm going to talk a little bit about just a few of these so that we can see how these dimensions of health are not only for us personally, but they really interconnect us with other people and how our wellness and our mental health are really dependent on others. So I'm going to look at emotional health. Our emotional health is based on a number of factors. What you've been taught. Do you have good emotional vocabulary? Have you been taught how to manage different emotional experiences? Have you been taught how to express what you're feeling, what you're thinking? When we're looking at a pandemic, you may be having thoughts and feelings that you certainly have never had any kind of preparation for. So that's one thing that may be influencing our emotional health. It's influenced by your relationship with yourself, but also your relationship with other people. Are your relationships strong, solid? Are they maybe more fluid? Is there conflict? Are you suddenly trapped in a very small space with folks that you get along with really well, and that's promoting your emotional health? Are you trapped in a space with folks where there's a lot of tension already, and now you have limited space kind of your own, so that can affect your health as well. your emotional strategies, the ones that are used by you and the ones that are used on you or against you, and the messages that we receive. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about the source of some of those messages and how you might consider managing those differently during a pandemic. Another example from that wheel, and again, I'm not going to go through every aspect, we don't have that much time, but financial health. This is something that really touches back on the beginning of our discussion today. You know, access to money and resources. It is certainly not consistent across all people. It is also not consistent across specific events. You know, we're seeing a lot of questions about job changes, about whether or not you're able to go out to your job. You know, are businesses going to be able to stay open? What are some of the things that are going to happen as a result of the pandemic? And so those kinds of things can influence your financial health, which not surprisingly is connected to your emotional health. You know, if you are struggling with your financial or job security, or maybe you have a roommate, or you're tied financially to your family and there's insecurity there around finances or job, that can certainly increase anxiety, increase stress. It's going to change your occupational health. So those things are really interrelated, not only internally in your own life, but also with the lives and experiences of other people. You may also see maybe your financial health is great. You're feeling really stable. You feel comfortable or safe right now. But there may be other people in your life who are experiencing some sudden, unexpected financial hardships that are really changing not just their financial situation, but just the way that they process emotions, their language, the way that they talk with other people, whether they're expressive or whether they are turning more internally to deal with what they're experiencing right now because of some of those changes. And even local, state, national, and global economies can influence our mental health. You know, just the conversation that we were just having about what's happening in the world, what's going on in different countries, what's going on in our own country, who has control of what. Those things can increase our stress. It can raise existential questions. You know, what are we doing here? What's important in my life? What do I have control over? Those kinds of things can certainly influence our health as well. The third one that I'll touch on specifically is social health. One of the things that influences our social health is just our ability and our access to both connect and disconnect to other people. So for some of us, we may be really feeling taken away from others and really be longing for social connection. And so the ability to use Zoom, use social media, connect electronically, even just a telephone. I've gone back to writing old-fashioned letters just to feel like I'm connecting with other people. It can be a really helpful tool. But even folks who love social connection, we all also need the ability to disconnect from other people. And that can be challenging, especially if you're in an environment where you are in a very small home, and suddenly there are a lot of you staying at home and you don't have a lot of space for getting out and kind of being apart and just having some downtime, time when you're not being asked to connect with another person. So your ability to connect and disconnect can influence your social health, which has an impact on your emotional health, your mental health. Also, other people's ability to connect with you. I saw an absolutely precious video of someone's 93-year-old grandmother in Ireland. He posted it to social media and said it was a little message from my wee granny. And she was just telling him that she was doing okay. And that clearly from his presentation of that video had a strong impact on his emotional health, just to know that someone that he loved was safe and healthy and doing okay in the middle of this. And so you may experience that as well, or others may suddenly want to talk to you, maybe even people that you haven't talked to in a while, maybe reaching out and you're thinking, man, where did you come from? So that may be a product of what we're seeing, but that can influence our social health and our mental health as well. I wanted to touch on just the messages that we're receiving. There are tons of healthy messages out there that can really improve our social health. The videos of folks singing off their balconies, The message that Dr. Neely posted, I teared up while I was reading that. It was fantastic. Just hearing folks supporting one another is incredible. But also, there are a lot of messages that can really deteriorate our social health. Some of those intense fears, that doesn't mean that expressing an intense fear is negatively or is necessarily unhealthy, but a constant expression of fear or exposing yourself to expressions of fear from lots of folks all the time is really emotionally draining. So that's just kind of an overview of how we're interrelated. Some things I wanted to touch on about mental health during a pandemic. And so I've given you some maybe normal circumstances versus this type of an extreme circumstance. So our emotional tolerance may be, I want to double check and make sure I'm seeing that message. Sorry about that. Our emotional tolerance may be pretty good on a regular basis, but you can expect during a high intensity situation like this that your emotional tolerance may be much lower than normal. So if you already have a naturally low emotional tolerance, it may be very much lower. It also may be very much higher. So oftentimes when we experience stress or trauma, we flip to the opposite of our normal way of being. So for instance, my normal life, when I am just kind of chugging along, everything's great, I am very comfortable with not having a lot of details. I'm kind of low key, I can go with the flow. When I'm in a high stress situation, I want details, facts, figures. I want to understand what's going on. I want to see a complete picture. So you may see folks who are usually so easygoing, suddenly getting real. It might look like controlling, but it may be just that they're using their stress style to just self-soothe, to help them to feel like they can navigate what's going on. Ambiguity tolerance may be different. So you may, have that comfort typically with things being kind of up in the air. You may not have that same kind of comfort. You might want answers. I want to know what's going on, what's going to happen, what are the answers. That can, especially at a time like this, be really difficult. And then our reactions in normal everyday, you're going to see the same type of reactions from the same person. But in this type of situation, the reactivity may be very different. Somebody who's typically very reserved, they suddenly be much more expressive. Somebody who's really very expressive may become very quiet and reserved. And so I want to give you a few strategies. Again, trying to get my presentation here. So with all of these, you're going to expect to change. When you're looking at a pandemic, expect things to be different than they are normally. Give one another space. So don't expect the same type of emotional tolerance, ambiguity tolerance, or reactions from other folks. Be patient, kind of slow down your reaction, give folks a little bit of room, ask others to give you some room. Say, hey, I know we're going to be a little bit different during this, so let's take a beat. We're having a conversation and we feel those tensions rise. Let's sort of step back for a moment, just give each other a little bit of space to get through this. I strongly recommend avoiding unnecessary emotional stimulus. So if you're, typically watch a lot of dramas or a lot of really intense entertainment, really violent entertainment, thrillers, that kind of thing, you might want to reconsider how you spend your entertainment time, what you engage in, because you're already tolerating emotions that you're not used to tolerating. So adding that on top of it is kind of adding undue stress to your system. And the other things that, just quickly, high levels of patience and compassion may be typical for you, high capacity for complex problem solving, and full access to verbal brain centers are normal. But in this situation, your patience may be different. You may feel kind of a brain fog. So you might go to the kitchen and think, what am I going to have for lunch today? And really struggle with, why can I not decide whether to have a sandwich or a bowl of soup? Why is this difficult? Well, part of it is because your brain is busy dealing with stuff that it's not typically dealing with. And one thing I think is helpful to note is that switch from of your verbal centers to more visual centers when you're feeling stress and trauma. you typically lose access to a lot of those verbal centers. So you may notice that you are experiencing your thoughts more as little mini videos rather than having a lot of words for what you're going through. So that's just, if you can expect that, it can help you to navigate it and tolerate it a little better. So again, one of the biggest strategies is to expect changes. It's really be patient with one another. One of the mottos that I live by is don't attend every argument you're invited to. Self-isolate when your patience is low. Really avoid unnecessary decision making. You know, maybe you're going to have a sandwich every day so that you don't have to make that decision. And then limiting some of your visual stimulus. So finally, just wrapping up, be different. Expect others to be different. You know, pretending like this is business as usual, it's just business at home, is not really the best way to handle your psychological health right now. Recognizing, being honest about the fact that this is a different situation and that you're going to be different and others will be different can really help you to navigate this more effectively. Slow down, lean back, pull back from things that are not necessarily required right now. Give yourself some space and time to just kind of sit with what you're feeling and learn as much as you can and share those messages with other folks. I would encourage you to opt out of social media messaging, especially the stuff that's directive rather than conversational. So things that are, you know, do this, don't do that, adds more stress. Whereas, you know, just if you want to talk about what's going on, let's actually have a conversation. But finally, I've given you some tools and resources here. This is a great time to engage in mental health counseling if you've never done that before. Across the United States, therapists have gone online to do telehealth, so it's easy to try that from your own home. And I've provided some other resources here for your use. So I think I went just a couple minutes long, but I'm welcome your questions and certainly any ideas of how you're managing your own mental health. We'd love to hear those as well.
Hey, thank you for that. So if you all have questions, send me a little note, or if you want to raise your hand, we'll get to you. I've had a couple of questions as these presentations have been going on about how we can make resources available, like the resources that Dr. Montgomery was just sharing. We will make things available on the Human Rights Center page that's featuring all the information from these teach-ins. And we are recording. These will be available asynchronously as well later on. So we'll try to make these things available for you in various ways outside of this specific moment. So while other people are thinking, I can get you started with a question. Meredith, what's your favorite strategy for yourself?
Oh, thank you.
Anything you didn't already tell us?
Well, no, I actually early on when this all started coming, put together my own list of good mental health hygiene. And at the top of that list is to bathe. You know, when we're working from home, we're spending a lot of time kind of disconnected from other people. We can just get out of a regular hygiene routine and just going through that routine. If you're teaching, sometimes that can help because you've got to kind of put yourself together before but just something as basic as engaging in standard hygiene practices can do a lot for your mental health. For your physical health, to help you feel refreshed and connected. I just got to remind you of your humanity. Limiting the number of information sources. Pick one or two information sources that you find really reliable and trustworthy, and stick with those, because hearing tons of messages from all over the place can really add undue stress to your mental and emotional capacity in the midst of all of this. And I've been taking daily walks with my husband, our little French bulldog, and baking bread.
Thanks, that's great. Dr. Pika, are you with us there? Would you like to get in and ask a question?
Yes, yeah, I certainly appreciate this. And I love the quote too, don't attend every argument that you're invited to. So I certainly appreciate that. I wonder if you have any strategies for how to convey to colleagues. So I've certainly been in some situations where colleagues are operating as if we're in business as usual. And so how to convey that, we may need to give ourselves and our students, spaces. I wonder if there's certain phrases that you might recommend to use.
Yeah, I think one of the things that I would start with is trying to understand what business as usual is doing for that person. If you can see that that may be a coping strategy for them. Some folks really want to push for normalcy because it helps to soothe their anxiety, and they feel like, well, if we can keep going, if we can just keep doing things, it'll be fine. It kind of proves to us that everything is fine. So if we can start from a place of compassion for that person and just maybe even engage them in a conversation like, hey, it looks like normalcy is something that you're feeling would be really helpful right now. Can you help me understand how that's helpful and help me to communicate to others how that would be helpful? And then also share with them, here's my experience of that push for normalcy and how it's raising anxiety in me and maybe raising anxiety in students, just to help them to connect with the human experience of what's happening there. I also find that just data on what's happening to the brain, there's so many incredible YouTube videos on neuroplasticity and brain chemistry, especially around trauma. So a few videos on what happens to your brain during trauma can really help people to see, hey, we're not trying to avoid work or just use this as an opportunity to escape, but we want to be realistic about your brain's capacity to handle all of this new information. And so sometimes somebody who clings to normalcy may also really benefit from your scientific information, some data, some facts to back up that argument that, hey, we need to back up a little bit. So I hope that's helpful. Thank you for that question. That's really great. I know that across the nation, counselors and mental health providers, whether they're counselors, school counselors, social workers, psychologists, psychiatrists, we're all engaging in conversations with one another. We chose to talk therapy, so we love talking about just about everything. But there are so many tools that are being created around how to help your own mental health and how to have conversations. This is a great time to reach out to local counseling centers, to use like Psychology Today to find someone local to you, and even have those links available for students or for colleagues, so that we can kind of be in the conversation together.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Montgomery, for this. It's really helpful to have somebody addressing this aspect. And I know academics are maybe more inclined to fall into control freak accomplishment mode. It might be my preferred coping strategy as well. So it's really helpful to talk this through. So we're going to take a break now, everybody, again, just for a few minutes, stretch your legs, get water, whatever you need to do. And we will be back at 5 o'clock with Dr. Ashley Lawrence Sanders. So we'll see you back then. history and African American history. And I'm going to let her take it away from here.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. This has been wonderful so far. What I'm going to talk about today, at least a little bit briefly, is to try to illuminate some of the histories around African Americans, illness, disease, and public health, and why that's so important for knowing what we now know, I think, is that African Americans may end up being disproportionately affected by the COVID virus. What was not so clear a few weeks ago is now becoming more and more clear, and I'll get into that a bit at the end. But I wanted to sort of start with, way back in the past, because a lot of the ideas around African Americans and disease and illness actually have their roots in the transatlantic slave trade and early European ideas about Africans and Blackness. One of the early ideas that seemed to persist were this contradictory idea that African Americans were both immune to certain diseases, they were like super strong, and their bodies were super strong, but also that they were unclean and also carriers of disease. These are contradictory ideas, and if you study the history of white supremacy and racism in the United States, you know that these contradictory ideas about people of color can exist at the same time. So early on, there was this idea about Africans both being disease carriers and overly prone to disease, or that they were somehow immune from disease, whatever suited the particular ideology. So to go a bit back, in 1793, there was a yellow fever epidemic that ravaged Philadelphia. And Philadelphia had the largest free population in the country after the American Revolution. Black leaders in the community, following the lead of Dr. Benjamin Rush, who, if you don't know him, he was a white doctor and physician who was an abolitionist and seen as a friend of African Americans as well, thought that African Americans were actually immune to yellow fever. Benjamin Rush was actually basing this on his observations from a yellow fever outbreak in the 1740s in South Carolina, where he says that, the African slaves weren't really affected. Now, the truth is African slaves likely weren't affected because they weren't in close quarters with white people in South Carolina because of the type of plantation system that existed in the South, where there was, huge amounts of separate, Africans living with relative supervision. But he carried on these findings to Philadelphia, and Absalom Jones and Richard Allen, who were prominent Black leaders in the community, actually took this on as fact. And they saw it as an opportunity to prove that they could be industrious citizens to the nation. Like, it was an opportunity to prove themselves as Black citizens of America to actually help in the epidemic. And they offered and volunteered the services of African Americans. So you see a disproportionate amount of Black people in service, Black nurses, Black people who were working to bury bodies. A lot of white residents of Philadelphia, particularly those in means, fled the city once the epidemic got out of control, and African Americans were sort of left to do a lot of the work and had volunteered in the work. What you see here in the image is what actually was sort of the memoirs of Jones and Allen after what happened in Philadelphia, and they're sort of talking about their reaction to the idea that they were useless, because there were some white Philadelphians who said they were useless. And Jones and Allen are countering like, no, we actually thought falsely that we were immune and we were stuck burying bodies. Black people themselves were affected by this disease and died as well in large numbers. And I think one of the things we can think about is not only the idea that Black people are often going to be more affected by a lot of these diseases and epidemics, but that when it comes time to the people who are working and have to work through these epidemics, and I think that's going to, get us near the present at the end of my presentation, is that those people are often overwhelmingly African Americans in particular communities. The people who are essential service workers, the people who still have to work and put themselves at risk to do this type of work. So by the time we get to the flu pandemic of 1918, the one that I'm sure many of you have heard about a lot in the last couple of months or so. Actually, when I finished teaching in my US history class, I finished my face-to-face. This was the last thing we talked about, funny enough, was the flu pandemic of 1918. And I made the point of saying that, you know, they were going to hear a lot about this as the coronavirus was starting to spread before I knew, you know, I wouldn't see my students again. But I wanted them to think through how the United States had dealt with the pandemic in the past. And in the case of African Americans, it was interesting because once again, there was this myth that African Americans were immune to the disease, that African Americans were affected less. Even Black doctors themselves thought this. In contrast, white politicians, many of them thought that Black people were the carriers of disease. In northern cities, where, you know, this is happening around the same time at the first wave of the Great Migration, where you see African Americans arriving in droves from the South into northern and Midwestern cities. The idea that Black Southern migrants were unclean and carriers of disease was actually boasted all across these newspaper headlines that, you know, Black migrants are bringing the flu with them or they're bringing these diseases with them. One of the top sort of, you know, health officials in Chicago actually blames Black migrants for bringing the flu and other diseases up to Chicago. So they become a scapegoat. And this is very similar to the ways, if you ever study or read about the history of the ways in which the wave of European immigrants in late 19th and early 20th century are treated as disease carriers or as people who are unclean, when the truth is the living conditions that they're in are, of course, a result of the poverty that they experience. Not, you know, them, of course, being naturally unclean or unhygienic. But these are the attitudes that are following African Americans at the time. So African Americans are not immune, of course. 1918 is actually a year in which more white people, the mortality rate for the flu is higher for white people than Black people. But a lot of the historians who've studied the role of race in the flu pandemic actually say we should not trust those numbers. I mean, you know, one of the public health, I think it was Sabrina earlier, talked about numbers and what we know about the numbers and what we don't know. And one of the things that we know is that when it comes to African Americans, they're often undercounted. And, you know, that's part of like what happens when it comes to any sort of case of health or disparities in health or racial disparities in health. We know that the healthcare and provider disparities meant that African Americans were less likely to gain adequate care and treatment. They were also less likely to be able to isolate or quarantine themselves, which was also a recommendation during the flu pandemic than white Americans were. So by the time we get to 1919, once again, African American mortality rate for the flu has once again surpassed the mortality rate of white Americans. And a lot of that, of course, is the unequal access that African Americans had to adequate healthcare, to doctors who would treat them. There's hardly any Black doctors. Black nurses are being, literally in the Black newspaper, they're begging people to take jobs nursing people because, of course, you can't get white people to nurse African Americans. So there are, you know, multiple problems which lead to African Americans experiencing a higher mortality rate by the time we get to 1919 from the flu pandemic. So just quickly, this leads me to COVID-19 and African Americans today. And on the left, you'll see these were columns that were written about 3 weeks ago. They were warning African Americans about the idea that no, Black people are not immune to coronavirus. This was a fairly prevalent rumor on social media about a few weeks ago. I saw it myself. I saw it in multiple Twitter posts and Facebook posts. Have any Black people gotten coronavirus? Black people can't get coronavirus. People were saying that definitively. There were memes that were passed around that, you know, because of Black people's ancestry, and you see it in, you know, sub-Saharan Africa, nobody in sub-Saharan Africa is getting it. So that means Black people don't get it. So we went within 3 weeks from the warnings, the very similar initial sort of rumor that we saw in the 1793 yellow fever epidemic and the Spanish flu pandemic, that Black people cannot get this disease, to now on the right, these two charts, which actually show they're one of the few states that have released racial statistics on who has gotten coronavirus and who has died from coronavirus. So right here in the pie chart is actually South Carolina statistics, which is my home state. And South Carolina, the Black population hovers around 25%, maybe a little more. And as you can see here, African Americans are 36% of the cases of coronavirus in South Carolina so far. I think the statistics is a few days old. The chart on the right is from yesterday, and this is Michigan. The state population, Black population in Michigan is 14%. African Americans are 35% of all cases and 40% of the deaths. And that's just what they've counted so far. If you can see at the bottom there, there's a lot that's unknown about, the racial classification of some of the cases so far. There have been calls to actually get race-based statistics on who has been diagnosed with coronavirus. And there are a lot of reasons for this. And they're the same reasons I was discussing previously, which is that we know the historical disparities of care as it comes to African Americans. We know that African Americans die at higher rates from nearly every disease, every major cause of death in the United States, from heart disease to cancers. We also know that African Americans are often the ones that are, African Americans are also the ones that are disproportionately underserved by hospitals, whether it be the state of urban hospitals or the amount of rural hospitals, the less amount of rural hospitals within the Black South. So in addition to Michigan and South Carolina, we know that Georgia has had many cases. In Albany, Georgia, which is a small town in a county that I think, it's in a county that only has 80,000 or 90,000 residents, they have had dozens of deaths. And almost all of them have been African Americans. So traced back to a funeral that was held at the end of February. And African Americans were disproportionately affected in New Orleans and Orleans Parish, which of course is mostly Black. A couple of other things to note is that historically African Americans have been affected by environmental racism in urban areas, which means higher levels of asthma and other respiratory conditions, which have emerged from living in places that are not as environmentally clean as other places. So the underlying conditions that put you more at risk for the severe versions of COVID-19 are heavily prevalent within African American communities. The other brief thing I'll say, and then I'll close up, is that the health disparities aspect of this, we can't really tell what's been happening on the local level or on a national level. And this is not unusual, because when it comes to health disparities in African Americans, it's always anecdotal data until they can actually do these studies. So anecdotally, yes, as a historian, it matters to me to hear the narratives of Black women who were refused tests in the hospital, Black women who were refused treatment, a young Black woman who I think is still in a medically induced coma in Brooklyn, went to the hospital 3 times. And on the 3rd time, they finally took her seriously enough. And then she never left the hospital and has not since. So we see and know that this is happening. And this goes back to a very long history of how African Americans have been treated by the medical field. The other brief thing I want to talk about, if you want to ask me questions about it also, is the way in which African Americans will be disproportionately affected by the economic changes that are going to happen. The type of jobs that are being, that people are being laid off and being furloughed from, service industry jobs, and those types of jobs, African Americans and people of color disproportionately are part of those jobs. Unemployment rate for African Americans were already much higher than other racial groups. And I think that what we're going to see is not just a disproportionate medical effect, but also a disproportionate economic and social effect within African American communities and for African Americans. So I'm going to close there. These are some resources. I suppose I could probably share some more later. There are, 3 really good books. There are even more. Medical Apartheid is one of the best about the history of medicine and African Americans, a really complicated and terrible history. Samuel Roberts writes Infectious Fear, which is a great book mostly about the TB outbreak in cities, but in particular about how segregation plays into issues of public health. And Alondra Nelson has a good book about Black Panther Party's activism against medical discrimination and their drive to create community health centers. Recently, at the top, Ibram Kendi just wrote this a couple days ago, an article in The Atlantic saying, why don't we know who has coronavirus, as a urging to get more data about African Americans and also a history of African Americans being affected disproportionately by these diseases. So I'll end there and I will take any questions.
Oh, I think my micro, this is Leslie Pica. So I don't know if Dr. Lawrence Sanders, if you can hear me.
And hi, Leslie.
Hi. Yeah. So, so fantastic presentation. Obviously, there's a lot to cover. There's also a book by Dr. Vernellia Randall, who was a UD law professor here, the Dying While Black book. And so certainly, I think we see a lot of these issues that you're raising that definitely impact us here in the Dayton area too, in terms of food deserts, in terms of health deserts. I didn't know if you could say anything about sort of how we see some of the issues that you're talking about just right here in our own backyard too.
Sure. I mean, I think what we're seeing, I mean, yesterday there was sort of a social media storm, as someone who's on Twitter, you know, regularly, where a New York Times writer tweeted out a map where it showed where people were social distancing and where they weren't. And the map showed that in the South, people were not social distancing, right? So then it's like this indictment of people in the South. And then, you know, smarter people brought up the fact that the communities that live in the South are, you know, many of them are poor, particularly poor Black communities, but poor white communities too. Just like communities in urban areas that were disproportionately Black or brown, have experienced food deserts where they have to travel much wider to actually get their needs, so wider distance. I mean, I grew up in the rural South. For a very long time, we had to travel 35 minutes to get to a grocery store. And right now it's maybe 15 minutes due to the gentrification of the area, but still, they can't go like 5 minutes up the road. And so this is true. We know this in urban areas in particular, the quality of food, first of all, the lack of food. And now that people are experiencing economic distress, the ability to get food. So food banks now are being crushed. I know in Cincinnati, I've just been reading and, you know, seeing some of the posts and stuff about what's happening in Cincinnati community where I live near. I'm sure similar things are happening in Dayton. Is that, you know, you're seeing communities that already were under crunch because of disproportionate levels of poverty now being doubly, triply crunched in a time of lack of revenue, and a time also where, you know, these same people are being laid off of their jobs. And I think we're going to see, while we're dealing with the immediate issue of the public health crisis, and I think that's the first and foremost priority, I think when we see the aftermath of this, we're going to see a devastating aftermath for Black communities.
Are there any other questions? Laura, would you like to ask a question?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I know that your research area is specific to the Black community. Do you know if there are similar, I don't know, I guess lack of good data on other, you know, subgroups within, you know, America, and how those sorts of things compare to the availability of data for your particular area of research?
Yeah, I think from what I'm seeing, it's true. I know I read an article earlier this morning about the indigenous communities and how Native communities were really struggling to get a good amount of data, and also already being disproportionately affected by COVID virus from the data that they have. if your city is the type of city, or if your state is the type of state who already does a good job of collecting this data, then you're doing better. I mean, we know in New York City that immigrant groups have been disproportionately affected by COVID virus. If you look at the maps in New York City, it's clear the neighborhoods that are Black or brown or immigrant heavy, which are pretty much an overlap in a lot of the boroughs, have high amounts of COVID diagnosis, and I think high amounts of deaths as well. But see, outside of New York, and New York is considered a quote unquote immigrant friendly community, outside of New York, what I'm hearing is that there's a lack of information for immigrants. I know in Ohio, it took them a little bit of time to actually translate some of the COVID virus information so that you know, people in the communities are getting that. I mean, I know particularly because my husband works at Catholic Charities, he's an immigration lawyer, that, you know, there are clients of his who really had no idea, you know, and about anything because they weren't.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
And I know that, you know, in a state like Ohio, which is very different than New York City, which has all these programs and everything else, getting the information out there. And there's a concern in some states in particular that immigrant communities are not going to come forward to get tested because they're going to be afraid to come get tested. In addition to the fact that many immigrants occupy the types of jobs that are still considered as essential jobs, as service jobs, putting them at higher risk. And also meaning that, you know, the jobs that, you know, people still need to be done and they're being underpaid in these positions as well. So I think for a lot of other communities, I've seen it already for Latino communities in particular, that, you know, there's a concern that, you know, the information isn't getting out there about the disease. There's not enough adequate information, which has been a problem. And I think I can't remember the professor who spoke earlier about the politics of this. And I think that that's also affecting it because in the federal system that we have, depending on your state or locality, you may be getting service better. That's a problem because we're getting state by state statistics, depending on whether or not the state wants to release the statistics by race or collect them by race. So we're probably going to end up having incomplete data in the end because of that.
Tony, would you like to ask a question?
I can't hear the question. I think he's still. Still muted.
Okay. Tony, we'll get back to you. We just have to figure out why the mute and unmute is not working on your side. Jennifer Gerard. Over to you, Jennifer.
I'm muted.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So my question is, what are some thoughts that you might be able to offer for how we might help students uncover some of these myths?
So one of the things that I have students look at, like, you know, for when I actually last semester, when I taught African American History 1, I talked specifically about the 1793 yellow fever epidemic. And one of the things I had them do was read some of the writings from Benjamin Rush and also from Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. And I wanted them to understand it within a historical context of how little people knew about medicine. First of all, that's one aspect, but how much of people's knowledge was predicated on social prejudices related to race. So much of medicine still, but historically has been predicated on the idea of like racial genetic differences. And, you know, not just genetic predilections, but genetic predilections that are based on race. And Looking at the primary sources, I think, are first really useful, because I feel like students reading this, it sounds bizarre to them, right? And then I talk them through the fact that, you know, Jones and Allen wanted to believe this also, because in their notion of proving themselves to be good citizens, they wanted to show that they were industrious, and they wanted to believe that this would not affect African Americans. Like, there was nothing truly malicious about it, about the belief that African Americans are immune. But then, you know, the continuation of it is almost always malicious, which is that African Americans don't experience pain in the same ways. We know these studies that are still out there now about current day experiences about this, med schools, you know, showing or talking about how African Americans don't experience pain. We saw in the opioid crisis, the reason why there was a lag in African American addiction to opioids. There's not anymore, but there was a lag. And the studies showed that it was actually because doctors were less likely to prescribe opioids to African Americans, so they were less likely to believe them when it came to pain. We know that the Black maternal mortality rate is very high. And we know that even adjusting for income for almost all of these things, Black women who are educated, Black women who are, you know, of higher income levels, all experience this gap. And what I tell my students is that ideas about race and ideas about the inherent nature of inherent nature of people, of Black people in particular in this case, lend themselves to this long trajectory. So I try to show them the timeline. And so when I told them about the thing about yellow fever last semester, they were like, oh, that's like they remembered the studies about Black people in pain that came out recently. Or they talked about, you know, the rumors about Black people and how Black people can't get certain diseases. So the ways in which, you know, it's supposed to be this positive attribute, right? But that it's used in a way to justify African Americans not getting the type of care that they should. And then coupling that with the historical injustices and disparities of the healthcare industry, of the field of medicine, leads to disastrous results. So I try to bring them into the present and the past and in the present, because those connections, they can recognize the language. It's very similar.
Meredith, do you have a question?
I do. Well, I don't know if it's a question, comment. First, thank you so much for the information and the perspective. I just wanted to kind of raise the point that this is not a problem that applies to outside of our student body, right? That this is not just the community out there, right? Mm-hmm. That this is really, when we're talking about inequities and we're talking about the common good. And I know I've experienced in meetings with other faculty some kind of shock or even just a reticence to consider these things. And so I really welcome your thoughts on just how we can encourage faculty to check on students, to not make assumptions about access to technology, resources, jobs, food, healthcare, all of those things. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's such a good point, particularly, you know, within the context of Dayton, right? And I think that, you know, there are a lot of assumptions that are made about what students at Dayton can do or don't do. I definitely did not make those assumptions, because knowing a lot of my students already, I knew that a lot of them worked outside of campus. I knew that a lot of them maybe didn't have access to internet, you know, printers, all of these things. So, you know, I sent out a survey to my students, you know, do you have that access? You know, are you working, or is this going to be a challenge? You have family responsibilities, all of these things. I'm just asking about that, with also the realization that, you know, for my students who are Black students in particular on campus, that the ways in which even the shutdown of the university is going to affect them is going to be a bit different. So for our first gen students, for our students who are from working class backgrounds, you know, and often those things do, not always, but do overlap with race. And, you know, how can we help people understand that these types of things are affecting them? And I think that we need to break down the assumptions of what our students can and can't do, and the general assumptions about race and health. I think that, you know, there's the idea that these are no longer issues, that everyone's treated equally. Right. bad headline that coronavirus equalized. It's the great equalizer. No, it's not. And I think these statistics are showing that there's nothing equalizing. It's exposing the historic levels of disparities across communities that already existed.
I'm going to try again with Tony, Ashley.
Sure. Can't hear Tony.
I can't either.
Uh-oh.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, cool. Well, we'll see. Thanks. I had a quick question. Thanks for the for your slides and your presentation. I wondered if you'd seen any good responses to the issues you were raising, or any good advocacy campaigns that deal specifically with, for example, the disparities facing African Americans or other marginalized groups. I've seen a few, but they deal primarily with occupation. For example, there's some great campaigns about farm workers and the additional responses we need to do for farm workers. But I haven't seen anything that's racially based or other marginalized categories. Thanks.
Yeah, so I can't say that I've seen a lot just racially based yet, though I have seen reporters pick this issue up rapidly. So if you search the news for this in the last couple of days, you'll see so many more articles than when I first agreed to do this teach-in that I knew people were going to be thinking about. That's one thing. And ProPublica had a very good one today, the one in the Atlantic. The other thing, though, I think is that Ayanna Pressley and Elizabeth Warren actually called on the government, and the state governments and the federal government to collect this data because they said that we need to know what the racial breakdown is, and they gave the whole history of, race and health and disparities and stuff. So they've called on that, so high-level politicians are calling on it. Locally, I've seen a group, I've seen a group of physicians, Black physicians, Black doctors, also kind of come together around this issue. I know that for a long time there's and I cannot remember the name, but there's a group that has been active around Black maternal mortality rates that has also been active around this issue as well. I think they're based in Philadelphia or New York. I can't remember which one, but they have been very active about this issue of COVID virus. Right now, I feel like everybody's just in shock mode, and we won't, we haven't seen it active. I think, like you said, there's been farm workers, there's been restaurant workers, there's been a lot of action around prisons and jails as well. Disproportionately Black and brown communities, that I have seen a lot of groups calling on lower level offenders to be released because this virus is spreading rapidly through many prison and jail systems.
Thank you.
So thank you, Ashley, so much.
You're welcome.
We really appreciate your time, and we'll take a moment and then move to our final part of this first webinar.
Thanks.
Now rapidly into the last section of today's teach-in, and that's a section on the human right to health. In this case, we'll be hearing both from Shelley Ingalls, who is the Executive Director of the Human Rights Center and Research Professor of Human Rights and Law, and also from Lauren Dernwald, who is a University of Dayton 2018 graduate with a degree in Human Rights Studies and Psychology, who is a graduate assistant in the Human Rights Center, assisting with initiatives, including the Malawi Research Practicum on Rights and Development. So I'm really pleased to bring you guys in to talk about the human right to health. I think, Shelley, you're going to start us off, and then we'll switch over to Lauren.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you all for staying on for this first part of the 4-part series of our webinar. And we're now going to zoom way back out, away from very specific dimensions of COVID-19 in the United States to the more global perspective, particularly around global norms for human rights. And of course, as I'm sure you're aware, the right to health is one of the core human rights that was initially offered in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights when it was drafted, and linked to this concept that we have in human rights around this adequate standard of living. So health and well-being are terms that were used in the Universal Declaration to understand what is an adequate standard of living for each individual, and linked to a range of other rights that it don't stand separately, but are in fact integrally linked, including food, clothing, housing, medical care, social services, right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, old age, and other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond one's control. So the concept of the right to health in international norms is very far-reaching, and it is very complex, but also quite well developed in our international framework. The subsequent international norm that spelled out the right to health more specifically is what we call the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. And it is married to another international covenant on civil and political rights. All these rights were included in the Universal Declaration together. They were then separated into 2 separate covenants. And in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the right to health is around the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. And you'll see on your screen now, we're starting to share the specific articles. This covenant around economic, social, and cultural rights has a very particular limitation to it as a part of it, the obligations. And that is something we call in international norms progressive realization. What that means, and this is not true of the International Covenant of Civil and Political Rights, in the economic, social, and cultural rights area, it is understood that many of these rights and their full realization for each individual links to the resources that are available to ensure them by the state, and that their realization can be hampered by that a lack of resources. So states and states by states, I mean countries, who take on this obligation and the obligations in this covenant do so under an understanding that they will progressively try and realize these rights most effectively using their resources in the most appropriate manner, and that financial and other resources can be an obstacle to the realization of these rights. The right to health in international law isn't just, as I said, a singular right. it has both freedoms and entitlements incorporated into it. And by freedoms, there's the obvious one, that the right to health includes the freedom to be free from non-consensual medical treatment and experimentation, and the right to control one's own body and one's own health to a certain degree. The right to health also includes a number of entitlements that is required for states to provide. This is where we talk often about healthcare as a human right. Entitlements that are incorporated into the international understanding of what is a right to health include health protection, health care, that and the underlying determinants of health that provide equal opportunity for people to enjoy the highest attainable standard. And these include, as I said before, on the physical and mental health side, that the understanding of health is holistic. The right to health also is incorporated or very tied to other economic, social, and cultural rights. As I mentioned in the Universal Declaration, those are spelled out quite explicitly. Our understanding globally of the right to health includes that people have a right to adequate nutrition and food. They have the right to water and sanitation, the adequate standard of living, which includes a right to adequate housing, and also incorporates many of our other civil and political rights. Those are freedom from discrimination, which I'll mention in a bit, and links to the prior presentation, the right to privacy and access to information, the right to participation, and in fact, the right to participation in public policy surrounding health is explicitly understood to be one of the entitlements that I spoke about in the right to health. And then the right to benefit from scientific progress and its applications. So the right to science is another right that is spelled out in the International Covenant of Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights. At the core of human rights law, or at the core of our understanding of human rights as linked to a fundamental appreciation for each individual's human dignity, is this concept of non-discrimination. And this is a pervasive part of international law and a pervasive principle throughout all work that's done on human rights. So the Universal Declaration requires equality before the law and an entitlement that everyone should enjoy all rights, including the equal protection of the law. And that is in each of the international norms that we have, that everyone enjoys these rights and freedoms without distinction of any kind. And international norms go through what those distinctions might be, such as race, color, sex, language, religion, political or other opinion, national or social origin, property, birth, or other status. So all, efforts to ensure the right to health in this comprehensive sense need to take into account the specific needs of people who might have, in historic sense, been discriminated against, or take into account the impact of any rules and obligations that might differentiate based on somebody's race, sex, or other religion, language, as I mentioned. And there is a recognition, as the prior speaker was talking about, that traditionally marginalized groups within specific countries have had a disproportionate number of health-related challenges, and that they carry different types of health-related burdens. And because of that, our international norms, and I'll hand it over to Lauren to talk about them more explicitly, focus in on particular groups and what the right to health means to those particular groups using specific standards. Lauren?
Okay. Hi, everyone. I'm unmuted now. Okay. So as Shelley mentioned before, there are a range of human rights norms that cover the right to health. And this can be found within several conventions within the Office of the High Commissioner of Human Rights. And this includes the Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, which includes in Article 12, specifically the prevention, treatment, and control of epidemic diseases. Additionally, the Convention on Eliminating Racial Discrimination calls on everyone, regardless of race or national or ethnic origin, to have an equal right to public health and medical care. The Convention Eliminating All Forms of Discrimination Against Women calls on equal rights within health and medical care between men and women. And this specifically applies to women who are living in rural areas, that they have access to medical services equally to everybody else within the population. The Convention on the Rights of the Children calls for the highest attainable level of health for all children. And this includes access to available technology, access to food and water, and also taking into account environmental hazards like pollution that may stand in the way of the highest attainable level of health for children. Also, the Convention on the Protection of Migrant Workers and their Families calls for equal access to health and medical care for migrant workers, regardless of their stay or employment status. And this also extends to their families. So members of families of migrant workers, including their children, should have equal access to social and health services. And finally, the Convention on Persons with Disabilities calls for persons with disabilities to have equal access to affordable health care and also health services that are close to the communities that they're living in. And importantly, the prevention of discrimination or denial of health care by medical professionals. So as Shelley mentioned earlier, we can see that the right to health is very intersectional, and it coincides with a lot of the other human rights that we see within UDHR and other health conventions.
So I'm going to pick it up here with how to monitor, or how the international rights related to health are monitored and enforced. They're obviously done through global institutions, and we'll get to those specific global institutions in a moment. But international norms have enforcement and monitoring mechanisms that exist and that are specialized to health. One part of that are international experts that are called special procedures of the Human Rights Council. There is, in fact, an international expert on, or this special rapporteur, as it's called in UN speak, on the right of everyone to enjoy the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. So that expert spends a lot of time drafting and writing reports, visiting countries, and explicitly communicating with countries and with NGOs, stakeholders, and those most impacted by human rights violations in relation to health about what the right to health should mean in those country contexts and what they should mean globally, and conducts a number of dialogues with relevant actors around improving the right to health. As you can imagine, in this context of COVID-19, this special procedure, as well as the range of other special procedures whose rights are directly linked to the pandemic, and in fact, as we'll get to in the end and throughout this webinar series, this pandemic implicates all our human rights, which are interlinked, whether they be economic, social, cultural, political, civil, or in relation to our environment. But the special rapporteurs have come out with very specific messaging globally around COVID-19. And one of those is about the right of everyone to access life-saving interventions in relation to COVID-19. The experts are highlighting the fact that this is a serious global challenge and a wake-up call for revitalization of universal human rights principles, and that states are required under international norms to provide everyone with access to care, testing, and all available resources. And they specifically calling out that the scarcity of resources or the use of public or private insurance schemes should never be a justification to discriminate against certain groups of patients in relation to the pandemic. There are also in international norms a bunch of committees linked to each of the international covenants that Lauren and I have been discussing. Those committees' job is to take reports from states around the human rights issues that they're experts on, and to provide states with recommendations around those issues. And they also provide global guidance to the international community about what each human right means and how it's intersectional with other parts of the international human rights agenda. So those are often called specific things like general comments or recommendations, but the committee that monitors economic, social, and cultural rights internationally has a number of guidance materials on what the right to water means, what the right to health means, what the right to adequate food means, and what the economic, social, and cultural rights of older persons are, all of which are deeply relevant to the pandemic. These committees exist for each of these international norms. So in relation to women, for example, you can find specific guidance from the international community about what women and health means, and what are the specific types of ways that states need to uphold the right to health for women explicitly, who of course experience health issues differently and differ from men. They have biological, socioeconomic, and psychosocial factors that are related specifically to sex and to gender differentiation in society, and that it's an obligation of states to address those differentiated impacts on an equal basis. It's also noted in international norms related to women that the health needs of women belonging to vulnerable or other marginalized, disadvantaged groups require states to pay particular attention to those needs. You can imagine for children, there's a range of specific guidance to countries about how to ensure children enjoy the highest attainable standard of health, and that states should prioritize explicitly children's health in a developmental sense, even in the context of political or economic crisis or emergency situations. It is noted that children's health is profoundly linked to the health of their families, and specific guidance has been given around ensuring children's health and for children who are migrant children or children whose parents are migrants, and that their health and well-being, access to education, adequate housing, safe food and water, health services is a requirement that states look at barriers to those for specific groups of children. Finally, in international norms, there is the International Sustainable Development Agenda that has been passed by all states in 2015 with the horizon of meeting 17 explicit goals with targets and indicators under each of these 17 goals by 2030. This Sustainable Development Agenda is the first one that is universal. It applies equally to developed nations, including the United States, as it does to the developing world. And within the Sustainable Development Agenda, there is a specific goal around ensuring healthy lives and the well-being of all at all ages. Though that SDG has 9 targets and 4 additional supplementary targets. And I just use one example here around the goal to achieve by 2030 universal health coverage, including financial risk protection, access to quality essential health care services, and access to safe, effective, quality, and affordable essential medicines and vaccines for all. As you can imagine, this COVID crisis and the crisis that the economic crisis globally that is a consequence of the need for social distancing is having a tremendously negative impact on the ability of the global community to reach these SDGs. And right now we're looking at far-reaching consequences on global GDP and on the economic security, particularly of states that are lower income and specifically of states that face a number of fragility and conflict factors. I will just let Lauren come in here and talk a little bit about the global institutions briefly that are linked to these norms and that are responsible for upholding them.
Sure. So there are, as Shelley said, several global institutions that uphold the norms of the right to health, one of which is the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, which is the leading UN human rights entity. And some of their responsibilities are things like mainstreaming human rights, upholding their governmental and civil society partnerships, setting standards and monitoring, as we talked about earlier, and the on-the-ground implementation of these rights. Another example of a global entity is the World Health Organization, who works with the UN to promote health, keep the world safe, and serve the vulnerable. And some of their areas that they target are universal health coverage, health and well-being, and also health emergencies. And within health emergencies, they work to identify, mitigate, and manage risks, and also develop tools that are necessary for outbreaks and other health emergencies. Another example is UNAIDS, which is leading the global effort on ending AIDS by 2030, and they are working in partnership with the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals. And one of their targets is the 90-90-90 targets, which includes 90% of all people living with HIV will know their HIV status by 2030. 90% of people will receive antiretroviral therapy, and 90% of people who are receiving this therapy will have achieved viral suppression by 2030. There are also several NGOs that are leading on international health and human rights. And one of these is Physicians for Human Rights, which addresses human rights violations and atrocities within, from a medical perspective, also Doctors Without Borders, Care International, and Population Services. So that wraps us up on the international organizations.
Okay, we have to finish up now. As I'm sure you can imagine, the right to health is not officially recognized in the United States. The United States is not a signatory to most of the conventions that we just discussed. They are listed here for you. It is also not an explicit right outlined in our US Constitution. It is, however, in 150 constitutions around the world explicitly recognized in some way the right to health or the right to health care. Finally, the impact of the COVID-19 crisis will hopefully have a number of positive benefits in relation to the U.S. in particular, its understanding of the right to health and health care, and its review of what it has been able to provide. The COVID-19 pandemic will probably highlight very explicitly the weaknesses in our global health systems and in the United States in relation to ensuring these rights. It will also demonstrate the connections between rights as we see ourselves, and as we've been discussing in this this webinar, the links between health and so many other aspects of our life and of living as humans in humanity and in a shared common way. It's also reaffirming the need for our global norms and institutions in a way that we often don't explicitly see as much, particularly in a US context, how critical these norms and institutions can be for our shared common good and for human dignity. I'll leave it there.
Thanks, you guys. That's great. So I'd like to invite those who are with us to let me know if you have some questions, and I'll be happy to unmute you so that you can get into conversation with Shelley and with Lauren. Just for a minute. Anything urgent? Okay, in the interest of honoring the time frame that we set out, we will go ahead and wrap up then. Oh, wait, I have a request for a question. So let's at least have one question in here. I'm gonna unmute Miranda. Pardon me. Is that working? There you are.
Can you hear me?
Hi, there you are.
Hi. Thank you both for the presentation. I'm wondering how politics has influenced the conversation around human rights, and particularly with this pandemic in relationship to the UN and the WHO and you know, the decisions behind calling it a pandemic and asking for resources and sort of those critical points, especially in the beginning as things were developing. What kind of politics are at play here?
Yeah, thanks, Miranda. Thanks for the question. I think there are a lot of politics at play. I think there was an expectation in the global institutions that global forms of collaboration and cooperation would be used earlier, as they have been in the past in relation to outbreaks such as the Ebola crisis in Africa or the SARS crisis. And I think what you saw with the leadership of the WHO, and including with the leadership overall of the Secretary General, who's just released a global report asking for solidarity, was frustration when the WHO had to proclaim this a pandemic. It essentially said that because of the lack of leadership that had been seen globally in managing this early on, that a COVID virus or a SARS virus, which would otherwise not be necessarily the type of virus that has ever been called a pandemic, had to be declared a global pandemic. Subsequently, you've seen a lot of concern on the international community side about the use of discriminatory language by global leaders around the origin of the pandemic being from a specific country, and scapegoating that's been going on, and the use of that language as highly discriminatory, and in fact creating an obstacle to the type of international collaboration one needs to actually fight a pandemic like this. And finally, the Secretary General has been extremely clear that without international resources going to support countries with fragile systems, particularly countries in conflict, he has called for an international ceasefire, or a number of ceasefires, since there are a number of ongoing conflicts around conflict, to ensure that the states that are really vulnerable do not become epicenters where you will see tremendous devastation and loss of life because of the capacity of the health systems, and where also, obviously, that brings into question the ability of the globe to, in an interconnected world, to manage this crisis. So I think the international community has been frustrated and deeply concerned about weaknesses in what are traditionally the mechanisms for cooperation and collaboration to address a crisis at this level.
Thanks for that. We do need to wrap up now since we're a little past 6 o'clock. I want to thank all of the speakers today, all of you who joined in to watch, people who asked questions, and those of you who stayed here engaging and learning. We're keeping the mission of the university alive doing this. And a special shout out to the staff of the Human Rights Center and the IT people from the School of Law who've been supporting us. So remember, next Wednesday, we're back again from 3 to 6 with a set of presentations all having to do with social justice and in particular focus on the concerns of groups who are most vulnerable during this time of pandemic. So thank you all. Stay safe, get some rest, be gentle with yourselves, and we'll see you back on Wednesday.